I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood in the parking lot of a building I had helped pay for, holding a letter that told me I was no longer welcome inside it. The envelope was cream-colored, thick paper, the kind that costs extra. My sister-in-law had clearly put thought into the presentation, even if she hadn't put a single second of thought into what it meant to hand it to me. I read it twice. Then I folded it neatly along its original crease, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into my bag next to my phone and my keys and the granola bar I hadn't eaten since leaving my apartment at 6 that morning. Then I got in my car, and I drove home. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I work, or I used to work, as the operations director of a small manufacturing company in Columbus, Ohio. I have a rescue dog named Fig, who chews through every phone charger I own, a studio apartment with good light, and about $47,000 left in a savings account that used to hold significantly more. I also have a brother named Daniel. He's 3 years older than me, which means he was there when our parents split, there when our mom got sick, and there every time the ground shifted under our family. For most of my life, Daniel was the person I called first, not second, not as a backup, first. That changed about 2 years ago, right around the time his wife, my sister-in-law, decided that my presence in Daniel's life was a problem she needed to solve. Her name is Renee. She's smart, polished, and absolutely convinced that everyone around her is either useful or in the way. For the first year of their marriage, I was useful. I helped plan the rehearsal dinner. I organized the seating chart. I picked up the flowers at 5 in the morning because the florist had a minimum delivery threshold, and Renee didn't want to pay it. The moment she didn't need me anymore, I became something else. I just didn't realize it until the letter, but I need to back up. Because the letter didn't come out of nowhere. It came at the end of a very long chain of events that I helped set in motion with the best intentions and the worst possible judgment. 2.5 years ago, Daniel came to me with a plan. He'd been running a small custom furniture workshop out of a rented space in Westerville for about 4 years. Good craftsmanship, loyal clients, a slowly growing reputation. He wanted to expand. He'd found a larger commercial property, a converted warehouse on the east side of Columbus with enough floor space to triple his output and add a small retail showroom in the front. The problem was financing. Daniel had strong revenue but limited credit history for a loan of that size. The SBA loan he was applying for required a cosigner with documented income and real property as collateral. I owned my apartment. I had been paying my mortgage for 6 years and had built up substantial equity. My credit score was excellent. On paper, I was exactly what the bank needed. Daniel sat across from me at my kitchen table with the preliminary documents spread out between our coffee cups, and he said, "I wouldn't ask if I didn't know this was going to work. I've run every number. I've had 2 accountants look at the projections. This is the right move. I just need someone who believes in me enough to put their name on it." I believed in him. That was never the question. I signed. The loan was for $210,000. My apartment, valued at the time at just over $300,000, was listed as collateral. In addition to co-signing, I also invested $60,000 of my own savings directly into the business as a capital contribution. In exchange, Daniel and I drafted a silent partnership agreement, prepared by a real estate and business attorney named Gordon Marsh, giving me a 22% ownership stake in the expanded operation. I want to be clear about something. I didn't do this because Daniel pressured me. I did it because I loved him, because I believed in what he was building, and because I thought our relationship was the kind that could hold the weight of a business arrangement without breaking. What I didn't account for was Renee. She hadn't been in the picture when Daniel first started talking about the expansion. They'd started dating seriously about 6 months before he came to me with the paperwork, and by the time the loan closed, they were engaged. By the time the warehouse renovation was finished and the business reopened under its new name, Heartwood Studio, which was Daniel's last name and my last name and the name we grew up with, they were married. The first year went well. Better than well, actually. The showroom drew foot traffic that the old workshop never could have managed. An interior design firm in Dublin started placing regular orders. A hotel renovation project came through that kept the workshop at capacity for 4 months straight. Daniel hired 3 additional craftspeople. I watched from a respectful distance, received my quarterly statements, and felt genuinely proud. Renee ran the front office. That had been the arrangement from the start. She had a background in retail management, and Daniel trusted her completely. I had no objection. My involvement was financial, not operational. I showed up for the big decisions, the ones that affected the partnership structure, and I stayed out of the day-to-day. Or I tried to. The friction started small. Renee began CCing me less on emails, then not at all. Quarterly statements started arriving late, then incompletely, then with line items I didn't recognize. When I asked Daniel about them, he said he'd look into it, and then went quiet for a few days before texting me something vague about the accountant switching software systems. I let it go the first time, and the second, because he was my brother and I didn't want to be the person who made success feel like a problem. Then, about 8 months ago, I stopped receiving statements entirely. I called Daniel. He didn't answer. I texted. He responded 12 hours later saying he was slammed and he'd call me back. He didn't. I emailed. No response for a week, and then a brief message from Renee's email address, not Daniel's, telling me that the business had undergone a structural reorganization and that my partnership documentation was under review. Under review. I called Gordon Marsh, the attorney who had drawn up my partnership agreement, and read him that phrase. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Claire, I want you to pull out your copy of the agreement and hold on to it. Don't let it out of your sight." I already had it in my hand. I called Daniel again. This time he picked up, but his voice had a flatness to it that I hadn't heard since our mother was dying, the particular tone of someone who has already had a very difficult conversation with someone else and arrived at whatever conclusion that conversation required. He told me that Renee had brought in a business consultant, that the consultant had recommended simplifying the ownership structure, that having a silent partner with a 22% stake was creating complications for potential investors they were in conversations with. He said it in the language of business, smooth and bloodless, like he was reading from a script. I asked him who the investor was. He hesitated. Then he said it was Renee's father. I sat with that for a moment. Renee's father, a commercial real estate developer from Cincinnati, investing in Heartwood Studio, the business that existed because of my savings account and my credit score and the piece of paper I had signed at my kitchen table, while Daniel looked me in the eye and said I wouldn't ask if I didn't know this was going to work. I told Daniel I needed to think. He said, "Renee thinks it would be cleaner if we bought you out. We'd give you back your $60,000. Just the $60,000. Not 22% of a business that had, in the time since I signed my name to it, grown into something worth considerably more than the $210,000 we'd borrowed to build it." I told him I'd be in touch. I drove to the workshop the following Thursday. I had arranged to meet Daniel there at noon. When I arrived, he wasn't in the parking lot. Renee was. She was standing by the entrance to the showroom with a sealed envelope in her hand, and an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sympathy, the look of someone who has decided to be gracious about something they've already won. She held out the envelope. She said, "Daniel thought it might be easier coming from me." I took the envelope. I read it in the parking lot while she watched from the doorway. It was a formal notice of intent to dissolve my partnership interest, citing a clause I had apparently agreed to, a buyout provision triggered by a majority ownership vote, which, since Daniel held 78%, meant his vote alone was sufficient. The offered buyout amount was $60,000. The deadline to respond was 30 days. At the bottom, in a separate paragraph, it noted that, as co-signer on the SBA loan, I would be formally removed from the debt obligation, pending the bank's approval, contingent on Daniel's creditworthiness being sufficient to assume sole responsibility. Pending. Contingent. I read that word 3 times. I folded the letter. I put it in my bag. I got in my car. I did not cry until I was on I-270, and even then I made myself stop before I got to my exit, because I needed to think clearly, and grief, however legitimate, was going to have to wait. I called Gordon Marsh from my apartment. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about him. When I finished, he said, "Can you come in tomorrow morning?" I was there at 8:30. Gordon walked me through the partnership agreement line by line. The buyout provision was real, it was in the document I had signed, but there were 2 things that Renee's letter had either overlooked or deliberately omitted. The first was a valuation clause. The buyout price wasn't $60,000 or any fixed number. It was 22% of the current fair market value of the business, assessed by an independent appraiser agreed upon by both parties. Daniel did not get to decide that my stake was worth what I'd originally put in. He had to pay me what it was actually worth now. The second thing was the loan. My name was still on the SBA loan, and the buyout provision in our partnership agreement explicitly stated that my removal from the partnership was contingent on my being fully released from all associated debt obligations before the dissolution took effect. Not pending bank approval. Not contingent. Before, if Renee's father invested and restructured the ownership before I was formally released from the loan, they were in technical default of our agreement. They had already started the process. Gordon said, "We need to send a letter today." It went to Daniel, to Renee, and to their new attorney, whose name was on the dissolution notice. It laid out both clauses in plain language. It requested a formal business valuation within 15 days. It stated clearly that any transfer of ownership, interest, or external investment that proceeded prior to my full and documented release from the SBA loan would constitute a material breach of our partnership agreement, and that I would be within my rights to notify the SBA of the unauthorized restructuring. I want to explain what that means, because it mattered. SBA loans have conditions. One of them is that material changes to the business structure, including changes to ownership, must be disclosed to and approved by the lender. If you restructure ownership while an SBA loan is outstanding, without notifying the bank, the loan can be called due immediately. All of it. $210,000, due on demand. Daniel and Renee had apparently not fully thought through that part. I know this because Daniel called me 4 hours after Gordon's letter was received. He didn't sound like he was reading from a script this time. He said my name in the tone he used when we were kids, and he'd broken something and needed me to help him figure out how to fix it before our mom found out. A tone I hadn't heard in 2 years. I let him talk. He said that Renee hadn't realized that their attorney hadn't flagged the loan condition, that the timeline had moved faster than expected because her father's investment window was closing, that he was sorry. He was genuinely sorry. He should have come to me directly. He should never have let her hand me that letter in a parking lot. I let him finish. Then I said, I need the valuation. I need to be released from the loan. And I need both of those things documented before any external investment closes. That's what the agreement says, and that's what I'm asking for. He said he understood. He said he'd talk to Renee. I said, Daniel, this isn't a conversation between you and Renee. This is a conversation between you and me and a contract we both signed. Please don't make me explain that again. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, okay. The next week was tense. Renee called me once, from her personal number, at 7 in the evening. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was precisely calibrated to sound reasonable. She said she understood there had been a miscommunication, that she'd always valued my contribution to the business, that she hoped we could find a solution that worked for everyone. I texted Gordon the voicemail recording and went to bed. The independent appraiser was agreed upon by the second week. Her name was Patricia Holloway, and she spent 3 days at the workshop reviewing financials, inventory, contracts, and client accounts. She was thorough and professional, and had absolutely no interest in anyone's feelings about the outcome. Her report came back 10 days later. Heartwood Studio, as of the assessment date, had a fair market value of $840,000. 22% of $840,000 is $184,800. Renee had offered me $60,000. I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading the appraisal report, and Fig put his head in my lap and looked up at me with the patient, uncomplicated love that only dogs are capable of. And I thought about Daniel standing in my kitchen 2.5 years earlier saying I wouldn't ask if I didn't know this was going to work. He was right about that. It had worked. Beautifully. He just hadn't been planning to tell me. Gordon sent the final demand letter the following morning. 22% of fair market value, per the appraisal. Full written release from the SBA loan. Executed and filed with the lender before any funds changed hands. Legal fees associated with the dispute, which were now substantial. A 30-day deadline before we would be filing in court and notifying the SBA of the pending ownership restructuring. Daniel called me that same evening. This time his voice was different. Quieter. Stripped of the corporate language and the carefully managed distance of the last few months. He said, she told me you'd just take the 60 and walk away. She said you didn't know about the valuation clause. I said, she was wrong. He said, I know. A pause. I should have read the agreement myself. I signed the same document you did. I said, yes. You did. Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear him breathing, and I thought about all the times in our lives when the silence between us had been comfortable instead of loaded. When we'd sat in the back of our mom's car on long drives and not needed to say anything at all. He said, is there anything I can do to fix this? Not just the legal stuff, the rest of it. I thought about the parking lot, about the cream-colored envelope and Renee's rehearsed expression and the word pending at the bottom of a letter that was supposed to make me disappear quietly. I said, pay me what the contract says, get me off the loan, and then give me some time to figure out if I still know how to trust you. He said, that's fair. The settlement was finalized 26 days later. $184,800, wired directly to my account. Full release from the SBA loan, executed and confirmed by the lender. Gordon's fees, paid by the other side. Renee's father's investment did not close on its original timeline. The paperwork complications that arose from our dispute pushed his window past the deadline, and he ultimately redirected the funds to a different opportunity. I don't know how that conversation went between them. I didn't ask. What I know is this. On the day the wire hit my account, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Fig asleep under my chair, and I opened the banking app and watched the number change. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 8 months. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter than that. The feeling of standing on solid ground after a long time of not being sure where the floor was. Gordon sent me a short message that afternoon. It said, well handled. You stayed calm through all of it. That made the difference. I thought about that for a while. I had stayed calm. Not because I wasn't hurt. Not because the betrayal hadn't sat in my chest like something cold and heavy for months. But because I had a piece of paper and I understood what it meant. And because, at some point in that parking lot, holding a letter that was designed to make me feel small and stupid and already defeated, something in me had quietly and firmly decided that I was none of those things. Daniel and I have spoken a few times since the settlement. Short conversations, careful, like two people relearning each other's language. He's still running the business. Renee is still in the front office. I have no idea what their marriage looks like from the inside, and I've stopped trying to imagine it. What I have is my apartment, which is no longer at risk. My savings account, which is fuller now than it was before any of this started. A lawyer I trust. And a renewed understanding of something our mother used to say, which I'd always taken as a general sentiment, and now understand as practical advice. Read every word. Sign nothing you don't understand. And never assume that love makes a contract unnecessary. She meant it for romantic relationships, I think. Turns out it applies to brothers too. I'm not angry at Daniel. Or I am, sometimes, in the specific way you're angry at someone you love who let you down. Not a burning rage, but a low, persistent ache. The kind that might fade over years if you're patient with it. I'm angrier at myself for the 8 months I spent doubting my own perception, telling myself I was misreading the situation, making excuses for silences and omissions that were, in fact, exactly what they looked like. But that anger is useful. It reminds me to trust what I see. The business is doing well. I know this because Heartwood Studios' work has started appearing in regional design publications, and every time I see a piece of Daniel's craftsmanship photographed in someone's living room or hotel lobby, I feel two things simultaneously. Pride, because he built something genuinely beautiful, and a clear-eyed recognition that I helped make it possible, and that I was paid accordingly. Both of those things are true. They can coexist. About 3 months after the settlement, I got a card in the mail. It was a plain white card with no return address, and inside, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were 11 words. You handled yourself with more dignity than they deserved. Well done. I don't know who sent it. Someone who knew enough about the situation to know what I'd been through. A mutual friend, maybe. Someone from the workshop who'd watched the whole thing unfold from closer than I realized. I put it on my refrigerator with a magnet, not because I need the validation, but because dignity is a word I want to remember, especially on the days when staying calm feels less like strength and more like exhaustion, when part of me wishes I had screamed in that parking lot, had thrown the envelope back at Renee, had let her see exactly how much damage that cream-colored letter actually did. I didn't do any of that. I folded the letter and I got in my car and I made a phone call. And now, I have nearly $185,000 and my name on a clean credit report, and Fig eating another phone charger under the table, and I think, on balance, that I made the right choice. Dignity doesn't always feel like winning, but it is.